I want to start this morning by telling you two little quick snippets of life, and one with sound effects. When I was younger, I guess every story is about when I was younger, right? Same with you folks. But I remember when I was, a teenager, and I found myself out visiting a farm, and at the farm there was he had some pigs, and there was a pen, and there was a little shack for them, and he had over the door was pretty big, and he had boards that he just put across the door. It must have been to keep some bigger animal out. But the little piglets, and the door was quite low, and the piglets had grown, and they were going, when they went into their little house, they had to bend right down, and their backs were all scraped from going through and having to duck under that board. And I was watching that, and the guy who owned the farm, he said, "I've been meaning to make that door bigger." So he reached over and he grabbed a saw, and he sawed the bottom board off to give the pigs room to go in. And so it was really funny. I remember watching the pigs, and the pig went up to it, and the pig went, and then he bent right down, and he went in. And then another pig came up, and down it went, and went in. And when they come out, they did the same thing, even though the board wasn't there. But they were so used to that they just had to do what they were always doing. And the reason that wasn't initially, I wasn't going to mention that, but it reminded me this morning, I reminded myself of that when I got up early this morning. And I was up, 5:45, and I went out to the kitchen, I was making the coffee, and I tend to put too much coffee in the coffee. And so my coffee's not usually as good as when Denise makes it. But I always think it needs 5 teaspoons full, and she has 4 teaspoons full. So I was making the coffee this morning, and every morning is the same thing. I'll put the 4 in, I'll go, just a little bit more. So this morning I said, 4, that's it. So I did 4, and it was like, to put that spoon back in the sink and make the coffee. And guess what? It was good. But see, I'm so used to putting 5 in that it was hard for me not just to put 4, because I'm used to it. Now, believe it or not, I'm going to tie those two little stories into our text this morning. And our text is from John chapter 21. And just, Father, I pray you'd help us with your word today. Speak to our hearts. May we be encouraged, and may we find direction in your word that'll help us through the week. I pray in Christ's name. Amen. John chapter 21, and I just want to read just the first couple of verses. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples at the Sea of Tiberias. And on this wise showed he himself. There were together Simon Peter and Thomas, called Didymus, and Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, and the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other of his disciples. And Simon Peter said unto them, I go a-fishing. And they say unto him, We also go with thee. They went forth and entered into the ship immediately, and that night they caught nothing. So there's quite a context to this verse, these 3 verses. This was a very, very eventful time in the lives of everybody that was involved. If you read chapter 20, you'll realize that Jesus had risen from the dead, and he had appeared to them on several occasions. And actually, Mary Magdalene, when Jesus appeared to her, she ran, and the first person she went to was Simon Peter. And she told him that Jesus had indeed risen from the dead. And so these people, everything was turned around in their lives. Nothing was the way it was. They had to deal with some pretty big news, some pretty significant events in their lives that they had to deal with. And so Simon Peter's response to all that was not what you would expect. He was confronted with this news, and then he says, you know what, I'm going fishing. He said it right away, and then he went fishing right away. And he's a lot like us. He's a lot like me anyway. And I'm sure that he's a lot like you. Sometimes, when things didn't really go the way Simon Peter and the rest of the disciples thought it would go. I mean, they were living in a time that was very oppressive. They were ruled by the Romans. The church had a very strong foothold in the community and in the society, the Jewish faith, and there was a lot of laws there, and it was run that way. But also, over on top of that was Roman rule, and Roman rule could be quite restrictive and be quite forceful. And so the disciples looked at Jesus as somebody that was going to liberate them from all of this oppression. And they really did. And that's one of the reasons why they enthusiastically followed him, because they looked around at their lives and they thought, well, this life is pretty rough. We got to pay a lot of taxes, and there's a lot of oppression. And here's this Messiah. He's come along, and he's going to deliver us from all of this. They weren't really planning on Jesus dying. Like they just couldn't conceive of that. When Jesus told them that he was going to die, they said, well, no, Lord, that's not what we see. Like they didn't want that to happen. They wanted him to deliver them from the oppression that they were living under. And so that did not happen. Jesus died, and I can't even imagine how they felt after all that. And then news comes that Jesus is back to life, and he's appeared to some people, and Simon Peter's response is, I'm going fishing. Now, he just didn't decide to take up a new hobby there. He just didn't decide to take up a new profession. He knew how to fish. He was a fisherman. And he decided, you know what? I'm going to deal with this in my own way. I'm going back to something that I'm familiar with. Has that ever happened to you? You're confronted with a challenge. You're confronted with a change. You're confronted with a huge problem. And you just revert back to what you're used to. I mean, how many times has it been when things start going the wrong way, you just want to run home to mama, right? Because I want to run home to what I'm used to. I want to run home to where I feel safe. I want to run home to what I'm accustomed to. And so we tend to want to do the same thing. And if you think about it in this context, and you look at different people and look at different lives of some folks that you know, and even in yourself, you see people doing the same thing over and over and over again. Don't you? I mean, in relationships, have you known anybody in your life, whether it's a male or a female, but somebody that's been in a bad relationship and it just didn't go very well, and they were with somebody who was just, not the nicest or most desirable person, and the relationship was very tough, and then that relationship fails, and then that person goes right into another relationship just like that. Have you ever seen that? Yeah. And you look at it and you scratch your head and you wonder, well, how can this possibly happen? Why does a person go from one bad experience to another bad experience that's a lot like that bad experience that they just got away from? We have an expression in our society, you jump from the frying pan to the fire, right? And it's because, if you read about it, a lot of people who study that kind of thing, it's because they're used to that kind of a thing. A person who gets who has very tumultuous relationships, they're used to that. They're used to how they feel when they're in that relationship. They're used to the shot of adrenaline that they get from having those rough times and those difficult arguments and all of that and the shouting. And if there was none of that, it'd be pretty boring, right? How many times have you found yourself in a circumstance, maybe it's at work, and a problem comes up and you find yourself doing the exact same thing that you tried to do before? I mean, I'm terrible that way when it comes to computers. I'll sit at my desk and I'll turn the computer on and something could be wrong and I'll go click, 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 click. Doesn't work. So what do I do? Click, 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 click. It still didn't work. Click, 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 click. And then finally I get exasperated. Well, it's me that's the problem. The password has not changed. It's me that's not doing it, but I keep trying to do that thing because I just think somehow if I do it the same way this time, then it's going to work. We tend to want to do the things that we're used to. And even in our relationships with one another, have you ever found that you have a situation come up? Now, Pastor Bill, I know you have because you've confessed it to us many times. It's one of the things I love about him. He's real. But have you ever found yourself starting to say something and you realize, I really shouldn't be saying this. I'm going down the wrong road. And that's not going to be good for me. But you still, because of the way you feel, right? Because of your past and because of how you've been conditioned, you just respond in this way knowing that it's not going to be good. It wasn't good for me last time. And it wasn't good for me the time before then. And it wasn't good for me the time before that. But I'm going to try it this time just to see if it's going to be a different outcome. And it's like Dr. Phil says, how's that working out for you? Well, not that good, Dr. Phil. And we see the same thing happen to Simon Peter. He says, I'm going fishing. And immediately they jump in the boat and they go fishing. And how'd they do? That night, they caught nothing. Nothing. Or as my Newfoundland neighbor used to say in Truro, nutting. N-U-D-D-I-N-G, Bob, nutting. They caught nothing. It didn't work out, even though they were fishermen, and even though they knew how to fish, and even though they had a boat, and even though they had nets, it didn't work out. You see, sometimes in life, you have to do something different. Sometimes in life, you have to stop doing it the way you've always done it. Albert Einstein says the definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting a different result, right? And yet we find ourselves doing that over and over again. And I remember myself thinking, why did I do that? Why did I say that? It's because I'm used to it. That's the way I've programmed myself to do things. And I just seem to go back when I'm in an uncomfortable situation. I go back to doing things the way I used to do them, even though in the past it hasn't worked. You see, that's where faith comes in. Because faith is the evidence of things not seen, the substance of things hoped for. Faith, and we all understand the context with regards to salvation. Faith causes us to walk in a different way. I used to walk in the darkness, and now I walk in the light. I used to fellowship, this way, and now I fellowship this way. I used to act this way, and now I act this way. And that change in the way I behaved, that outward change, was because of an inward change, and that inward change came because of faith. So sometimes faith is going to cause us or prompt us to do something different. If you don't have any faith in the fact that things could change, then why bother changing your activity? Why bother changing what you do if you don't really think it's not going to make any difference? I mean, we see the same thing played out all the time in politics, right? I stumbled across an article in one of the local papers about one of the mayors in one of our communities, and there's a gentleman now who's a mayor. When the existing mayor of the community quit, only one person ran to be mayor. And so that person became the mayor. I know the person, he's a pretty good, decent person, and when the time come for the revote, he now is the mayor of his town. But how many people thought, oh, well, what's the use of me trying to run for mayor? Or what's the use of me going out and voting for, because it's not going to make any difference? No, in a town of 800, 100 or 200 people voted in the town of 800. Everybody that voted had a real effect on the future direction of that town. Or people thought, well, what's my vote worth? No, your vote is worth something. If you don't believe it's worth something, then you're not going to bother to go to vote. But if you believe it's worth something, if I believe that what I do makes a difference, then I'm going to change what I do. So faith, you see, is the substance of things hoped for. Because I believe that this is down the road for me, it's going to cause me to act in a certain way. Faith causes me to act differently. Faith causes me to have a different perception of the way things are. When you run from it and you don't have faith for the situation, I'm going fishing. I'm going home. I'm taking my marbles and I'm going back home. You just want to run back to something that's familiar, but faith will cause you to have a different outlook. And faith, sometimes you have to do something that looks exactly like something you've done before, but the circumstances change a little bit, and it totally throws you off. Now, I'm used to walking. It's pretty easy. And I'm used to walking in a straight line. And so is everybody here. But if all of a sudden I found myself 30 floors up in a skyscraper walking in an I-beam, I can't do that. Could you? I know how to walk. The beam's this wide, and I'm only using this much of the floor space right now. But because it's in a different circumstance, a different situation, I just all of a sudden freeze. I can't do it, right? But somebody that's used to it, they've done it all the time. Because it's what they've done in the past. I'm sure the first time they went up there, it wasn't that easy. It's the same with us. When we get to a new circumstance in life, something that you're not totally comfortable with, you tend to want to run back to what makes you feel good. But sometimes that inhibits us from really making progress in our lives. It's not always good to just run back to what's familiar. It's not always good to just do what you've always done in the past. You see, just a little bit of faith sometimes will make a big difference. In John, if we go down to verse 6, we see when they were coming back into the shore, there was somebody waiting for them at the shore. And he had a fire going, and he had some fish cooking, and he had some bread for them. And they didn't know who that person was at the time. And that person said, well, how'd you guys do? And I said, well, no, we haven't caught a thing. And that person says, in John 21:6, cast your net on the right side of the boat. Just change it up just a little bit. It's the same boat. It's the same nets. It's the same bait or whatever they used back then. It's the same sea. It's the same crew. Just take your nets and throw them on the other side of the boat. Throw them on the right side of the boat. What happened when they did that? It filled up so full they couldn't bring the net in. See, they just changed one little thing, and basically a stranger told them to do that because they didn't recognize that it was Jesus, right? They did later on, but he said just change it just a little bit. Don't do what you've done all night. Don't do what you've always done. Just change things up a little bit. I have it here in my Bible somewheres, and I don't know what page it is, but it's actually written here next to an appropriate verse, and it says something like, June 1st, 1989, I apologized first. There, I'm done. But that was hard to do because I thought I was in the right. Right? Just change it up just a little bit, and you will see you could see a completely different result. It's like walking on the beam. You see, if I'm walking on the beam, and many times in life that's an analogy for walking in a new situation, something you're not sure of, something that challenges you a little bit. Well, if you learn how to look unto Jesus, the author and the finisher of your faith, you don't see what's down below. It's the same thing. It's the same thing when you're golfing. When I was first golfing, and I was standing here with my club, and right there was a pond. All I saw was the pond. I didn't see anything else. I just saw the pond. And then eventually, I learned to look to where I wanted to land the ball, down there on the fairway. And I'd still see the pond, but I was trying to focus on the fairway. At least I realized it. And then eventually, all I'd see was the fairway. And when that happened, guess where my ball didn't go as much anymore? In the pond, right? And eventually I didn't even see the pond. And I remember hearing a speech one time at a conference, and the gentleman was speaking, and he was a very highly acclaimed speaker down in the States, and he was a golfer, and he said, I was golfing with Lee Trevino. Does anybody know who Lee Trevino was? All right. So he was golfing with Lee Trevino, and he said, I was just getting ready to hit the ball, and Trevino says, this guy was a motivational speaker, that's why he was talking at the conference. He said, I was just getting ready to hit the ball, and Lee Trevino says to me, don't hit the ball in the water. So I said to Lee Trevino, I said, you can't psych me out. I'm a motivational speaker. My mind is on the goal. I'm looking at that fairway. That ball is going straight across to the fairway. And Trevino said, I noticed you're using an old ball. And I said, I'm using an old ball in case I hit it in the water. So then he proceeded to hit it in the water. You see, it's what you focus on, right? Just changing things just a little bit. Just a little bit. Cast your net on the right side of the boat. Now, you've been doing it all night your way. Now just try something different. See, they didn't know it was Jesus telling them that, but they did it. They did it anyway. Sometimes Jesus, and there's different places in the Bible where people were talking to the Lord and they didn't really know who it was. In John chapter 20, verse 16, just before then, we read this. This is when Mary went to the grave. Jesus, he said unto her, Why weepest thou? Whom seekest thou? She, supposing him to be the gardener, saith to him, Sir, if thou hast borne him hence, tell me where thou hast laid him, and I will take him away. Jesus said unto her, Mary. And then she recognized who she was. You see, sometimes that little bit of advice might come from the gardener. Sometimes it might come from a teacher. Sometimes it might come from a neighbor. Sometimes it might come from a good friend. Every now and then somebody might give you some good advice, and that little bit of advice might be just the thing that you need in order to proceed from where you are. If you keep trying to do it your way, the way you've always done it, you might not get a different result. But you see, it takes a bit of faith. Here's a fun fact. Walt Disney. Anybody heard of Walt Disney? Do you know who Walt Disney was named after? His parents were very devout Christians. They were Congregationalists. And the pastor of the church where Walt Disney grew up, his name was Walter Parr. And Walt Disney was named after the pastor of the church that his parents went to. And so Walt Disney had a very, very solid Christian upbringing. And what Walt Disney did was he took the word faith and he kind of like shined it up a little bit and called it imagination. He called it imagination. Because imagination will help you to believe that anything is possible. Imagination will help you to believe that you're bigger than the problem that's in front of you. Imagination will help you to see what's at the end of the road, right? Imagination helps you not to focus on where you are, but where you can be or where you want to be. I don't think it's any coincidence that Jesus said, except you become as a little child, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. Because without faith, without believing, without imagining, it is impossible to please God. For whoever comes to God must believe, must imagine that he is a rewarder of those that diligently seek him. Faith. Faith will cause us to do things just a little different. You see, with a child, anything is possible. A child doesn't care that asking for an ice cream didn't work. They'll ask again. And then they'll ask again. And then they'll ask again. And again. And again. And again. Until finally, mom or dad just gives in and said, fine, here's an ice cream. Right? The exact same story is in the Bible. The woman and the judge. She just kept knocking and knocking and knocking and knocking. Right? Until she got that different result. So imagination, faith, will help us to believe that, you know what, I can make it over to the next thing. I'm not going to run just to what makes me feel comfortable because, well, how's it worked so far? The times when something really good have happened in your life, think about those times. You probably did something different. You probably, I met somebody new last week. And I had their number for a long time. And I looked at the number and thought I should give them a call. And, okay, I'm busy. And then finally I just there's a number, tick, 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 tick. Bingo. Talking to somebody new. Met somebody new. You know, just because it did something a little bit different. You can't run back to what makes you feel comfortable. I remember at a point in my life, before I moved to Prince Edward Island, I lived in Truro, Nova Scotia. And I was unemployed. And a gentleman who I worked with before and we became friends with, and he was a psychologist. and he was really good at what he did. And I remember talking to him. I called him one day, and there was somebody in the family that had passed, and the whole conversation was just about him. Tell me, so-and-so, and it's been tough. And a couple of days later, I got a call, and it was my friend Earl. And he said, Bob, you called me a couple of days ago, yeah? And I spent the whole time just talking about me. Why? And I didn't even ask how you were. So he says, how are things? I said, well, things are good. I got a lot of time in my hands. I got laid off at work. What? He says, look, I'm coming to Truro next week, or whatever it was. I'm coming to Truro, and I want to talk to you. So I remember I was sitting in my den, and this guy comes in. He was visiting. He's the in-laws down the road. And then he come to my place, and he sat down, and he said to me, he said, look, I've been working with people for years, helping them transition from unemployment into working. So he was an outplacement officer. And he said, you've been helpful to me in the past. I'm going to put you through my program for free. And he said, by the way, I've been paid, the least I've been paid for this is $5. The most was $25. I'm giving it to you for free. I thought, this is awesome. So he said, okay, in order to do that, though, you've got to be completely honest and open with me. I said, okay. And I thought, what do I have to lose? So he said to me then, he said, describe to me your perfect job. And I thought, okay, I'm going to do it. I'm going to put myself out. And I described this job, and it's been something that I've been wanting to do for a long time. And I just did it. Didn't worry about how it sounded. I described it. And then he said to me, why aren't you doing that job now? And I thought, I'm going to be completely honest. And then I said to him, because I don't have enough faith in myself. He said, we're going to fix that. And he said, we're going to go through this program, and if you completely do the work that I give you, he says, I guarantee you this is what's going to happen. You're going to get to the point where one day you're going to see that job, and you're going to realize that this is your job, and you're just going to go, and you're going to get it. I said, okay. And so I did. Over the winter, we met every second week, and he gave me homework, and it was not easy. I really spent hours working on this stuff. And I remember even one week, he was a Catholic man, and one week we went to a Catholic monastery, and there was a wing that nobody was using, and he knew the owner, the people that ran the monastery. And so we got each a room in this wing where there's none of the monks staying, and we go for walks in the garden, and we talk, and he challenged me. He called them truth exercises, and I just did it. And I went through all of that, and then I remember one day, and I was working at the mill at Irving in Truro, and that was a tough job. And I was on lunch break, and I was going through the paper, and I never really go through the paper. I don't buy the paper, but it would just happen to be at my desk, and I was looking down, and there was an advertisement for a job. And something went just like that. And I thought, that's it. And I remember getting on the phone the day after that and calling the regional manager for this company down in Nova Scotia, and I knew who he was, and I said, Mark, it's Bob. Oh, yeah, Bob, how are you doing? I said, Mark, I seen the ad in the paper. I'm the perfect guy for that job, and that's not me. I said, I'm the perfect guy for that job. I said it with conviction. And he said, you know what? You're right. You make sure I get your resume, and I'll put it in the right place. And a couple of weeks later, I started that job. And at that point, that was the best job I ever had in my life, and I was there for 7 years, and I loved every bit of it. But the only way that I got that was that I was willing to do something different. I didn't run back to my comfort level. I challenged myself, and I stepped out in faith, as it were, and I did something different, and that different thing got me a different result. Interestingly enough, there was a guy, and I might have mentioned this before in one of my talks, but there was another gentleman that worked with me on the same crew at the mill. And he had a pretty big job, and he lost his job, and he's working at this job. And he was kind of a sour type of a guy. You know, the glass is always half empty. And I remember telling him, about this program that I was going through. And I said, you know what? I said, how about this? How about if I bring you with me through that program, and everything that I talk about with you and I will do together? He said, no, I wouldn't want to do that. And I thought, wow, that's crazy. He's not happy, but he doesn't want to do anything about it. And I remember the day that I resigned, when I resigned my job. I remember the last day of my last shift at the mill. He came up to me and said, you're such a lucky guy. And I didn't say it, but I said, luck had nothing to do with it, buddy. I was willing to do something about it, and you'd be in a different boat too if you were willing to do something about it, except just complain. You see, when you're willing to do something a little bit different and not just run away to your comfort zone, you'd be surprised what God might be able to do for you. And now I want to read one more scripture for you before we close. In Ephesians chapter 3, verse 17 to 21. And here Paul is praying for the church at Ephesus. He says, that Christ may dwell in your hearts by faith, that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and depth and height, and to know the love of Christ, which passeth knowledge, that you might be filled with all the fullness of God. Now unto him that is able to do exceedingly, abundantly, above all that we can ask or think, according to the power that worketh in us. Unto him be glory in the church by Christ Jesus throughout all the ages, world without end. Amen. So the next time you're faced with a difficult situation, the next time you're faced with a trying circumstance, the next time that you find yourself at a crossroads and you can do one thing or the other, don't be too quick to say, I'm just going fishing. Don't just say, I'm just going to do whatever I did before. Have the faith to step out. It's not easy. A little bit of you has to die. A little bit of who you are, a little bit of your pride, a little bit of whatever it is that you've built up from the past has to die. And take that one step, just like Peter when he took a step out of the boat, remember? Just be willing to do that and see what happens. God bless you. Amen. Amen.